Tariff Wars and Climate Policies. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Canada and the US are now in a trade war of sorts, and people are outraged on both sides of the border. Most people think that this is a unilateral move and there's no provocation. President Trump has noted certain issues related to fentanyl, border security, but I think there are other things that we should also be looking at. And that's the fact that Canada is pursuing climate policies that the U.S. House Judiciary Committee deems to be a war on the American way of life. And we're pursuing climate policies that are directly opposed to every move that the U.S. administration is making now on climate change. So I hope to give you some background information, see what you think about it, and give you some resources for more research on your part. You don't have to agree with anything that I say. I just want to broaden the conversation. So let's have a look at what I found. So what gets traded between Canada and the U.S.? Well, the U.S. buys more raw materials from Canada, and Canada buys more value-added manufactured goods from the USA. This is from Visual Capitalist, and so they say that 78% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are raw materials, parts, components, and services used to create other goods in the U.S. And here's the top 10 exports to the U.S. Vehicles, auto parts, mineral fuels, including oil, machinery, other commodities, plastics, wood, electronic equipment, gems and precious minerals, metals, aluminum, and paper. And the top 10 USA exports to Canada: vehicles and auto parts, machinery, electronic equipment, mineral fuels, including oil, plastics, other commodities, medical, tech equipment, aircraft, spacecraft, iron, steel products, furniture, lighting, and signs. So this is the fact sheet of the President Donald J. Trump imposes tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. So if you want to follow that link, you can get all the details there. And this is from Karina Gold, who is a candidate for the Liberal Party leadership in Canada. Some of our viewers overseas may not know, but the Canadian Parliament has been prorogued. That means there's a cessation of operations in the House. There's no Parliament active right now. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that he will step down as soon as a new leader of the Liberal Party is chosen. So there are a number of people vying for that position right now, but Parliament's not in session. So we're kind of a lame duck in terms of dealing with this tariff situation. So here's a statement from the main people running for the Liberal Party leadership: Frank Baylis, Mark Carney, Ruby Dalla, Chrystia Freeland, and Karina Gold. So their joint statement says that President Donald Trump's unilateral decision, an assault on our country's long-standing economic partnership, his unjustified tariffs, his unfair tariffs, and unjust tariffs. So they all want to stand up for Canada. And you know what? I want to stand up for Canada too, but I don't think that it's a good idea to be very aggressive when you have an extremely large competitor who's mostly a friend. So lots of people want to fight back in kind. Mark Carney, probably best known as the former Bank of Canada governor, former Bank of England governor, and also the UN climate czar. He says that President Trump thinks we're pushovers. He doesn't know Canadians. We'll stand up for our country. We'll stand united. We'll get stronger together. And Chrystia Freeland on CNN is saying, oh, just cut it out. So Brian Lilly, who's a commentator here in Canada, journalist, is saying that's not the best message. And unfortunately, at even our hockey games, people are booing the U.S. anthem. Of course, ordinary people are scared because they know that this is going to affect their jobs, the industry, costs of living. So the thing is, what if the world has changed? I suggest that people have a look at Peter Zine's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. I think it was written in 2019, so things have even changed since then. But his theory is that the U.S. is basically going to draw back from being policeman of the world, that since COVID and the broken supply chains that happened, the world has been busy friend shoring, meaning going to countries that share your values, share your trade concepts, your economic concepts, capitalistic or communist, whatever, but you're going to look for people who are your friends, people you've relied upon in the past, and who are geographically close to you. So that would suggest that Canada and the U.S. should have an excellent relationship and not be at war, but somehow we are over these concerns. Another issue is that Europe is on the brink of economic disaster, largely because of the climate policies they've adopted. And China is on the rise, although it also has problems. If you listen to some of Peter Zine's recent YouTube videos about it, he sees China as facing very serious problems, but nonetheless, they have also expanded around the world, as you will see shortly, and they are a threat to the United States of America. If you read Peter Zine's original book, The Accidental Superpower, he talks about how America became a superpower partly because of its geography, being surrounded by oceans and lots of distance from other warring countries. But let's go on and have a look here at other things. So let's have a look at what's happened in the world. In the past few years, a new alliance has been formed called the BRICS expansion. Not everybody's heard of that, but you can see on this map that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have formed the basis of the BRICS. That was formed in 2010, and it's now accepting new members. So these are new members: Iran, the UAE, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Argentina. And these countries in yellow have applied for membership. And you can see here that the BRICS nations will have 43% of the world's oil production. They'll also have 46% of the world's population and almost 30% of the world's GDP and about 25% of the exports of goods. You can see that America is isolated from all this, and Europe is kind of trapped by the BRICS and the distance between the United States, Canada, and of course, here's Greenland, right? But China has a project that they began some time ago called the One Belt, One Road, OBOR, also known just as the Belt and Road, and the Polar Silk Road. So you can see here that the OBOR, the One Belt and Road, goes from China to Europe, and the idea was to create trade pathways by rail or by sea. Very ambitious project. They've invested a lot in all these different countries to help make this happen. They've also started on a Polar Silk Road. This is kind of hard to see because here's Canada, that's Alaska, here's Greenland. So you can see they want to run marine traffic right through the Arctic Ocean. That might not be what everybody wants. So I tried to flip this here so that you could see this is Canada, here's the United States, and here's Greenland. So if you can visualize that previous map, I'll just go back so you can see it again. So they want to run a Polar Silk Road here and down here. So you can see that this would be concerning to the United States, both in terms of defense and in terms of access to markets. So what if the conflict right now, the tariffs, are also about climate policy and carbon markets? For instance, the USA has abandoned climate hysteria, but this European Union CBAM drives growth in global carbon markets. So that's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, basically a climate tariff on imports. And here's Guy Verhofstadt, a former Belgian politician and part of the a member of the European Parliament, as I recall. Anyway, he's stating fair carbon pricing is the key to saving our climate. The EU carbon border tax on cement, steel, aluminum, etc. is a major step forward. And the carbon outlook brightening as investors slash short positions to a one-year low. Now, you have to realize that in November, just after Donald Trump was elected as president of the United States, the climate cult got together in Baku, Azerbaijan, and they finally figured out how to do international carbon trading via Article 6. So after a decade of negotiations, they finally got it off the ground, and then Donald Trump was elected, and he pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So what if this is also a US-EU trade and tariff war? So this statement by Mark Carney, who's a candidate for the Liberal Party leadership, he says we won't stand by as illegal US tariffs hurt our workers and their families. And he also says if we can no longer rely on American neighbors, we must diversify our trading relationships and build new sources of jobs and growth based on our immense resources, our talented people, their innovation and industry. Well, this is a press release that we issued in June 25th, 2024. Mark Carney's GFANZ, that's the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, targeted in bombshell climate cartel report by the U.S. Judiciary Committee. And here's an excerpt saying, the report claims that the climate cartel imposes these radical policies by weaponizing ever-escalating pressure tactics on corporations. One of the tactics is forcing companies to make immaterial disclosure of carbon emissions, a tactic being pushed in the US and Canada. And if you recall, back in 2019, Mark Carney was then the Bank of England governor, and he said that firms ignoring climate crisis will go bankrupt. By contrast, the U.S., under President Donald Trump, on day one of his inauguration, he issued this executive order unleashing American energy, which withdrew the United States from all of the climate policies dating back to 1992. And right now, domestic climate policy is a 404 on the White House office website. Now, who are some of the players in this climate cartel? Well, there's the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, which is a group that Mark Carney put together at COP26 in Glasgow. The UNPRI, that's the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment. It has about 5,500 members, something like that. They sit on assets of $112 trillion. They're all climate obsessed, and they're also the source of ESG and DEI. There's Climate Action 100 Plus, Global Investors Driving Business Transition. They're mentioned prominently in that report on the climate cartel. Design to Win is a plan that was put together by a large group of philanthropies in about 2007, where they plan to fund environmental, non-governmental groups to agitate for the policies they wanted, as if it came from the grassroots. And there's a Net Zero Banking Alliance, also UN-led, but or bank-led, UN-convened, also put together or convened pretty much by Mr. Carney. And this is a snapshot of the money that the Climate Works Foundation has been pumping into these ENGOs, like over $600 million a year, and that's been topped up by charitable donations in matching order. So you can see there's a huge investment in this idea of pushing for net zero, pushing wind and solar, reducing emissions, etc., etc. But net zero is a no-go in the USA right now. So this is part of the executive summary of the climate control exposing the decarbonization collusion in environmental, social, and governance ESG investing. So I'm just going to look at parts of it here. Accordingly, U.S. antitrust law prohibits anti-competitive collusion and social justifications proffered for a restraint of trade do not make it any less lawful. Meaning that even if you say, well, we're saving the planet, it doesn't matter. It's still unlawful. The Committee on the Judiciary sees this collusion not only violates fundamental free market principles, it also threatens to raise costs and reduce choice for millions of American consumers. And they also say, through their commitments to groups such as Climate Action 100+, the members of the climate cartel expressly have agreed to decarbonize the American economy by forcing corporations to disclose their carbon emissions, to reduce their carbon emissions, and to enforce and reinforce their disclosure and reduction commitments by handcuffing company leadership and muzzling corporate free speech, and petitioning. The climate cartel imposes these radical policies by weaponizing ever-escalating pressure tactics that start with negotiations with corporate management, continue to filing and flagging stockholder proxy resolutions, and culminate with taking out the boards of directors at recalcitrant companies. That's pretty wild, but it's actually really happening. One of the things they like to do is to put forward some impossible shareholder resolution. And if the board doesn't go along with it, then they, in the document, they say that they come along and they refresh the board by getting rid of certain board members and plunking in people who will align with their values. The problem here is that if you're a shareholder, you invest in a company hoping that it will make a profit for you. And that's the objective of the company, to do good business, to deal with their core business, and to make a profit so that you, the investor, get some return on your investment. Now, of course, there are market conditions that happen where you don't get a return like you expected. You may have bad management. That also happens. But these are market conditions. They're not imposed upon you. They're not contrived. And that's the problem here, is that these Climate Alliance financial groups and such like GFANs as well, they're contriving market conditions, and they want you to not profit at the very core business that your corporation is good at. And if you don't comply, then they'll replace you. So, this is very contrary to American principles of free trade and doing business. So you can see why this arrangement is not going over well. And in fact, they say the climate cartel has declared war on the American way of life. The climate cartel is waging a global world war for net zero against disfavored American companies, including those in the fossil fuel, aviation, and farming industries that allow Americans to drive, fly, and eat. So here's an example related to flying. Now, just so that you know here, major banks are abandoning their climate alliance en masse. So pretty much since this report came out, all of the members of GFANs and the Net Zero Banking Alliance and many other such firms have abandoned these organizations because they realize, wow, we could be up for antitrust charges. We could be sued by our shareholders. So this is an example from the report. The euphemistic term for output reduction refers to actions taken to limit the demand for jet fuel through the curtailment of demand for air transportation. So if you've been finding it a little hard to fly as freely as you used to, it's probably related to this climate cartel. This is what the report states, referring to one of the documents from a cartel member. Demand management will require policy interventions, which may take the form of market-based measures. For example, carbon pricing, passenger flight taxes, frequent flyer levies, or regulation. Example, banning short-haul domestic flights where there is a high-speed rail alternative, which has actually happened in Europe. Company disclosure requirements around corporate travel, public awareness campaigns. In addition, aviation companies themselves can take measures to manage demand or bring about behavioral changes, for example, by ending frequent flyer reward programs, ending advertising campaigns that target growth in developed markets with already high per capita flights, disclosing the carbon footprint of flights at the point of ticket purchase, or by entering into partnerships with rail operators to offer combined air and train tickets. Now, I'm guessing many of you have seen these things happening and wondered, well, why is it when I buy a ticket, they're telling me what my carbon footprint is? Well, it's because of the climate cartel. So the climate cartel are the investors in the airline telling the airline, here, make flying more miserable for your people. Make them not want to fly by doing these things. Make them feel guilty for flying, make it more difficult to fly, tell them they can't have a short haul flight, they have to take a train if there's one available. So these are contrary to shareholder interests, and they're contrary to the interests of the airline itself. They created the airline to fly you where you want to go in the best possible way at the best possible price for both you and the airline. So this is demand management, and it's, of course, not only happening in aviation, but as noted in the war by the climate cartel, the war on American way of life, it's aviation, it's fossil fuels, it's even food, steak, right? So you can see why the new administration would be kind of upset about this, and probably be even more upset by the fact that the European Union is now starting to apply the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this is from a separate item, but the carbon border adjustment mechanism is all about reporting emissions, and that task is already proving to be very difficult. For example, manufacturers of raw materials in some countries may not be keen to share data on the carbon intensity of their operations, but the EU does not appear to be backing away from its intention to export climate ambition. Now, imagine, why would a company not want to report all of its emissions or its sources of materials? Well, in the old days, that used to be called corporate espionage. People would try to get into your company and find that out. Now they're being forced to state it publicly, report it publicly, or they can't properly sell their materials, or they can't keep their investors in the climate cartel happy. So you can see how this is going to distort trade in very serious ways. If I'm a competitor or a competitor nation, and I know that you need X amount of fuel or materials or whatever, then I know exactly how to crater your company. Just make it impossible to get those materials, or drive up the price of that particular material, or make sure that the shipping of that material doesn't happen in a timely way. There's lots of ways that this distorts the market, and can distort it even through a non-malicious event. But the thing is that when companies are being forced to report, or not be able to do business, that's a kind of war. And so the definitive regime of CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a climate policy tariff, is that the EU importers of goods covered by CBAM will register with national authorities. They can buy CBAM certificates. So this is like carbon trading. This will be calculated depending on the weekly average auction price of the EU's emissions trading allowances, expressed in euros per ton of CO2 emitted. And EU importers will declare the emissions embedded in their imports and surrender the corresponding number of certificates each year. If importers can prove that a carbon price has already been paid during the production of the imported goods, the corresponding amount can be deducted, which is why Canadian officials are keen on a carbon tax. So Robert Lyman is our policy advisor, and he went through the fall economic statement and made up a little list of climate policy related issues. One of them was using climate policy to restrict trade. And so the Canadian government wants to follow the European Union in that manner. And Robert Lyman commented, "What timing, proposing to impose carbon-based tariffs to restrict imports from the U.S. would be the equivalent of waving a red flag to the Trump administration bull." And mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. As I just noted, the U.S. House Judiciary Committee sees that as part of the climate cartel war on America. So, the government recently announced it's moving forward with mandating climate-related financial disclosures by large federally incorporated private corporations. So, as I said, Robert Lyman said, "What timing, proposing to impose carbon-based tariffs to restrict imports from the United States would be the equivalent of waving a red flag to the Trump administration bull." And also, I think we have to consider the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is the best-known U.S. policy toward the Western Hemisphere. It warns European nations that the United States would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs. So it's not a doctrine that's gone away. And yet here in Canada, the Toronto Star is suggesting Donald Trump drives a wedge between Canada and the U.S. with a trade war. Could we join the EU? And over there in Europe, Guy Verhofstadt, Trump's dangerous tariff scheme is a blatant attack on its own people and a gift to billionaires while tearing apart his closest allies. The EU must not bow to his bullying tactics, call out his dangerous self-serving agenda for what it is, a power grab fueled by greed, exploiting the world's economy to serve the few at the expense of the many. Well, actually, maybe Canada's plans for CBAM should be cancelled, because they're seen as a war on the American way of life. Now here's the unelected Mark Carney on the UK BBC aligning Canadian climate policy with the EU and the UK. Also on world trade, he suggests granting favorable status to climate activist net zero countries who is like-minded here, who respects their trading arrangements to our climate policy, enhancing our climate change policy, our emissions policy here in Canada, including the way we would treat our trading partners. And even historians are jumping on the bandwagon. Canada and Denmark share a 1.2 kilometer long land border on Hans Island since we ended the Whiskey War in 2022. So technically we could join the European Union. Well, planet savers, the US border is right here. The UK and the EU are on the other side of the ocean. So one container ship puts out the pollution of 50 million cars, and a large container ship emits the carbon dioxide of 20,000 cars. So don't you think that if you want to save the planet, it would be better to go across the border rather than across the ocean? Just checking with you. And Canada is not the only country facing this kind of tariff from the US. So Trump announced he'll impose tariffs on the goods manufactured in the European Union. And it will be mainly tariffs on the goods made in Germany, as if Germany doesn't have enough trouble already. But Canada's going to go ahead with mandatory climate risk financial disclosure. The US is not. So instead of being productive and making real things, companies in Canada will have to count carbon molecules from scope 1, 2, and 3. And Carney tries to say here that jacking up his industrial carbon tax on big polluters won't have any impact on consumer prices. This is economic illiteracy from the Global Economist. It's BS, and he knows it. In this interview, he's kind of mockingly saying to the interviewer, buy in a steel company, how much do you use these days, Todd? Well, he's suggesting that nobody buys steel en masse. That's true. But when you buy a car or a fridge or a stove, it's all got steel in it. In consumer terms, the cost of counting molecules will be passed on to you. Now, there's an interesting report from about 2013 from Interpol. It's a guide to carbon trading crime, because this is a market that deals with the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. People actually pay money for that. And it's a good report to read. It explains cap and trade in simple and straightforward terms. But it also shows the pitfalls of these kinds of international markets. And really, who's the biggest emitter in the world? It's China. Even the United States, which is the second largest emitter, is not even close. And how about Canada? Well, we're like nothing. And here's the EU and the UK, also nothing. So why are we going ahead with these crazy climate policies? And by the way, NASA's space mission shows Canada's net removal of CO2 is the world's largest. So this is from our recent CLI-SCI, which is our bi-monthly newsletter. And it says Canada's biosphere absorbed a net 1,580 megatons CO2 per year, which are 2.5 times our CO2 emissions. So Canada caused a net CO2 removal of 960 megatons CO2 per year from the atmosphere over 2015 to 2020. Canada's net CO2 removal from the atmosphere is significantly greater than any other country. So obviously, we shouldn't have a carbon tax in Canada, and none of these other crazy climate measures should apply. Furthermore, CLINTEL, the international network of climate scientists and scholars, says there's no climate emergency. So there's almost 2,000 scientists and scholars signed up right now. You can see the list of signatories. You can see the World Climate Declaration, which explains that there's no climate emergency and that Mother Nature is more influential than humankind. So in fact, the world has changed, and we have to recognize that. I really recommend reading Peter Zine's book, watching some of his videos. They're free on YouTube. Read our report, Europe on the Brink. It not only tells the sad story of what's happening in Europe, but it gives some lessons for Canada, what we should do going forward. Definitely not follow the EU path. Definitely not follow the EU path. And also read A Multipolar World at Risk. What about energy security? And that's really the very first thing that the Trump administration addressed was the energy emergency. And as I showed you the maps, you can see there's also defense security issues as well. You You can learn more about Interpol and the carbon markets on our plain language website, climatechange101.ca. We just have redone it. It looks beautiful, I think. And this is the section on Interpol and carbon crime. And you can also counter the climate cult with our new book. It's called Energy and Climate at a Glance. It's the Canadian edition, 2024. It was done in partnership with the Heartland Institute from the United States and Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy here in Canada. So there are facts on 22 prominent climate topics. And our president, Ron Davison, professional engineer, was one of the lead authors, along with H. Sterling Burnett, PhD. And it's just a great little book. It's very straightforward. In fact, I have one right here. It's very straightforward, simple, not too many pages, lots of graphs, straightforward explanation, and it gives you an idea of the implications of these policies. Because, you know, on the surface, when people say we should save the planet, climate change is a threat, there's a climate emergency, we have to do this for our children. Of course, everyone feels like, sure, what can we do? Let's do it. Let's do the right thing. That's the first thing that most people think. But when you start to look at what that really means, and when you start to see the facts about whether or not there's a climate emergency, then things get put in perspective. And that's really what we're lacking. We're lacking open civil debate on these topics, and we're lacking perspective. And groups like the Climate Cartel in the United States, as the House Judiciary Committee said, they are censoring free speech. They are preventing companies from talking about these issues and how it's affecting their production and the costs to you. And of course, in Canada, those very same climate cartel things are happening here. And many of the big environmental, non-governmental groups, as well as the big climate-aligned philanthropies in Canada, are all connected to this climate cartel in the United States. So we are facing a tariff trade war with the U.S. in part because we are part of the climate cartel that is threatening the American way of life. That's how they see it. Whether or not you see it that way, that's something else. But that's how they see it. So that's what we have to deal with, as well as the other issues that have been made pretty clear in many of the statements from the Trump administration. So I hope that's given you a bit of a broader narrative on this issue, and really look again at those maps that I showed you, because who's protecting Canada's northern border? If someone invaded from the north, how could Canada fight back? I think that that's a very big consideration for the United States, because they look at that Polar Silk Road, they look at the Belt and Road, they look at the BRICS group, the alliance that's growing around the world, and they say, you know what? We better take care of ourselves, and we better take care of whatever is a threat to us that's near to us as well. So again, please have a look at our reports, and please have a look at some of Peter Zhang's YouTube videos and his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, because I think that it will give you more insights on how things are shifting dramatically in the world from how things used to be. And we're just going to have to deal with it. But I don't think that we're going to deal with it in an effective way if we're booing the American anthem and shouting about retaliatory tariffs without understanding these issues that I just presented to you. So, like I said, we stand for open civil debate on climate and energy policies, and also for full cost-benefit analysis before we adopt them. So I hope that you will get a copy of our book. You can order it on our website. They're $15 and plus shipping. You know, and a lot of people are ordering like 5 or 6 because they want to hand them out to their family, their friends, various influencers, because we need to understand these issues very well. in order to discuss them and make, rational decisions. So thanks very much for watching. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.